be part of the 5th annual cultural celebration of the Museum of Native American History. And the theme of the conference is indigenuity, which is indigenous ingenuity. And that's combining indigenous principles for innovation to solve the problems of today. And you will certainly get a lot of indigenuity with this panel. We have 2 superstar panelists, which I will introduce in a moment. First, I am Mary Smith, and I am CEO of the Caroline and Ora Smith Foundation. It's a foundation I started named after my mother and grandmother to train and support Native American women and girls in STEM careers. During this panel, you will hear from 2 fabulous panelists about their past in STEM, what they're doing to help other Native American women and girls, some of the challenges, and where we can go from here. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Robin Maxkii. She is Stockbridge, and I'm an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation. Robin is Stockbridge Mohican. She's an award-winning creative and Indigenous rights activist. She was the subject of the Google documentary Between Worlds, and if you haven't seen it, I recommend that you see it. She also co-starred in the PBS series Code Trip. From directing the first Native American collegiate hackathon to creating and penning national campaigns centered around Native American issues, her work regularly focuses on redefining storytelling through technology while broadening the participation of underserved communities within creative spaces. So our other panelist is Sarah Echohawk, and she is a citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma, and she has been working on behalf of Native people for over 20 years. She has been the Chief Executive Officer of the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, also known as ACES, since 2013. And prior to joining ACES, she was the Executive Vice President of First Nations Development Institute. She has also served as the interim CEO for the organization's subsidiary, First Nations Owesta Corporation. And before joining First Nations Development Institute, she spent several years working for the American Indian College Fund, raising support for tribal colleges and universities. So welcome, Sarah and Robin. And I'll turn to you, Robin. Why don't you start and just tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about your journey into STEM and how you got to where you are now.
Hi, I'm excited to be here. My journey into STEM was one of those, it sort of blindly happened where you don't realize that you're participating in technology. It was more a lack of access to resources, but I did have a library near me, and in my generation, it was about making your MySpace sparkly and putting your own graphics on it, which is how I learned HTML. And then I had a blog, and you sort of build on code, and it was these tiny little things, but those are teaching you something. But I never thought of myself as a coder. I never thought of myself as a person in tech. It was more just like, I want to make my blog sparkly. And this was sort of it was a side hobby. It was a way I expressed myself. The internet connected me to so many people. It was this resource that I was meeting people from all over the world. It was so exciting for me. And as this is going on, my life is kind of not going on this path. And I was sort of all over the place. And again, the internet was this grounding stability that I desperately needed and wanted. And no matter where I was at in the world or where I was going, I had this like grounding base, and I would go different cities, pick up a lot of pickup jobs. There wasn't like, college was not on the horizon for me, but I remember somebody commenting one day on my blog where they're like, if you're serious about changing things, you would go to college. And as a very stubborn, like 19-year-old, it's like, I don't need college. I already have this minimum wage job. But at the same time, it's like, I want to go to college. I just don't know how. And that started my track down, figuring out how to go to school, which is not something I figured out on my own. It was thanks to other people putting blogs and putting step-by-steps and seeing people like Sarah Echohawk and amazing people like the American Indian College Fund was also really pivotal in that, where it's like, okay, Natives go to school. Where do we go to school? how do I want to go to school? Where can I feel accepted? And I went to Dene College first and graduated, and proud graduate, and Salish Kootenai College second. And when I was at both schools, they both gave me so much access to resources, but more than that, just a sense of validation and a sense of self that I hadn't received before. And I realized no matter what I do, I'm Native. And no matter, there isn't one right way to be Native. And one of the great things that came out of this was, along with that sense of self, it's like, well, I can accomplish anything. I can do anything because I see people like Sarah Echohawk, and because we had Dr. Maxkii, who PhD teacher at Dene College. And I remember being like, a doctor, like I had never met a Native with a PhD. And it was those moments where like, this is what I want to do. I don't know how, but I want to get into this world, and getting internships and getting things like that all help open more doors. And it was just really building off of the work that other people have done. And then also that sort of plucky obnoxiousness of being a college student of like, well, we can do anything now. And a chance encounter with Sarah Echohawk really just kind of, that's where like, hey, we've been doing these kind of workshops and we have this, and I have this idea. Is there any way we can have space? And she's like, yeah. And I wasn't expecting that. Yes. And so it's a sense of, oh, well, then how does this actually work? And how are we going to do this hackathon? And what does this hackathon ultimately mean? And how do we do more of them? And how do we replicate this? And how does this actually serve the community? And then there's all these other questions. It's not just about the yes. And once you're there, it's more like, how is this going to help and empower other people? But I would say that's sort of the start into the world of tech and everything. But again, so many people had a hand in this and helped me get to these places. And now I work as a creative tech, where I get to do the creative projects on large scale things. And sometimes I get to see tech before it's out. And we try to find ways to make it appeal to the masses, which is really exciting, but also doesn't really make a lot of sense until a project is out. And then I can point to it and be like, we did that.
That's great. Well, we'll talk more about that later, because I'm sure people are interested. What does a creative tech mean? But first, let's hear from Sarah about her journey into STEM and being at ACES, and a little bit about ACES.
Sure. Nawa, hello, and thank you for having me today and allowing me to talk. And it's great to see you again, Mary, and the work that you're doing with Native women in STEM. So very supportive of that. And of course, to see Robin, who is just one of our amazing members of ACES. So for me, it's a little different. I actually don't have a STEM background or STEM degree, but my grandfather, who's a full-blood Pawnee, was a civil engineer, and did that work for a long time, and worked for the federal government surveying land. And so he was always at his drafting table and always working on that, and really passed that along to his kids. And so my dad, actually, John Echohawk, who's the founder of the Native American Rights Fund, he actually had an aptitude in math and science as well, but happened upon an opportunity to go to law school when they were recruiting lawyers around in the late 1960s on the war on poverty. So he ended up going that route, realizing that there was, an absence of attorneys, right, in Indian country, and the need for that. And I'll touch a little more on why that matters in a minute. Yes. So, but my older brother, so there's two of us, actually then was really gifted in math and science, and even in high school would go up to the university, because I grew up in Boulder, where Native American Rights Fund is, and take classes at the university, and then ended up being majoring in applied math and aerospace engineering, and worked on like a satellite Magellan while he was in school, and then became part of ACES, which was based in Boulder at the time. So he ended up getting all of his jobs through ACES. He worked for Jet Propulsion Labs, JPL, and NASA. He's now at Los Alamos National Labs. So he was really a part of ACES, and I knew the people from ACES because I grew up there. So I decided I wanted to go into some kind of advocacy work, and I'm really interested in education. So I got an undergraduate in political science, Native American studies, went to law school, and then got a master's in nonprofit management, because I knew the kind of work I wanted to do would be around nonprofits. So I started out the College Fund and then First Nations. And then this opportunity came up at ACES. And I thought, well, I don't have a STEM background, but I know the importance of STEM. And the way that I thought about it, and the reason that I came to ACES and wanted to make it successful was, in talking with my dad and my brother, it's like, well, we needed attorneys in Indian country in the 60s and 70s, right, to get our needs met, to get our rights, to assert our rights. And now we look around with all these economic development opportunities, and what we recognize is that in Indian country, there's a dearth of people with those STEM skills, right? So we don't have that STEM workforce, and we have to have that to build the infrastructure in our communities. And so I realized that this was a tremendous opportunity to kind of continue that work, right, in a different way. And I really see it, for tribal communities as an extension of sovereignty rather than bringing in outside experts. And then for others, really, when we talk about equity, is economic equity, because we know that STEM fields are the fastest growing, highest paying jobs. And so if we want to talk about, the chance for improving that wealth gap, then this is one of the places to do it. So I had sort of a backwards journey into STEM, so to speak. About the only thing I could say is I did tutor college algebra at one point, but that's about as STEM as I get. Anyway, so that's why I've been here. I've been here for 8 years doing this work, and it's just been tremendous. So, thanks.
Well, that's amazing. I know we'll talk a little bit more later about your work at ACES. But first, Robin kind of alluded to this. Tell us the story of how you two met and what you ended up doing together.
Well, as a student, you hear of ACES. It's one of those pivotal organizations you either belong to, or if that's remotely, even if you're not directly in tech or in science, ACES is just a great organization for Indigenous students. And so, I mean, since I've been at tribal college, I knew about Sarah, and I kind of a big fan, and I happened to meet her, and this is after we had shot the PBS series about tech, and we had been doing these little grassroots hackathons on the reservation and little workshops and stuff like this, because it's just, and it was really
interrupt you. Sorry for those who are listening, maybe not everyone knows what a hackathon is. Could you explain what that is?
Sure.
Just a hackathon, I always think of it as like a potluck of tech, because the thing is, there's no one right way to do it. So it's right. People just like, hey, want to build this, but I know this and I don't know like C+, like, can you help out on this? Or I don't know Python that well, but you know it, and I have this design, or someone else will have an idea. And so I like to think of it as a bunch of people getting together and building something, or talking about building something is sometimes how it works out. But either way, it was oftentimes, and that is, I would like to think that hacking is kind of a mentality in a lot of marginalized communities, because we're taking things and we're making something with the resources that we have around us, and we're making grand things, we're making great things. And so this was something that was really common at the school I was in. We would hang out in the dorms and would build things together. And then it was also realizing like, oh, like I have something that I can share with other people, because up until that point I didn't think, this is why I never saw myself in tech. I never thought that the things I was doing were unique in any way. And it's something that everyone can do. Like tech is a matter of time and opportunity and access to resources, but those are very important. So going back to Sarah, she was speaking at NACC, and I was on a student panel, and I see her because they allowed us to have this tour of
she was at NACC.
Yeah, and they allowed.
By the way, she was at NACC.
She's running the meeting at NACC, which has been, but seeing her, and then we're on this tour together, and I'm like, oh my God, here's my chance. And I was like, but at the same time, I have this cracked phone, and I like pull up the pilot of this like PBS series, because it has like Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, and I was like, maybe this will add validity to what I'm about to pitch. And I'm super nervous because I'm also meeting a hero of mine. So I was just like, Sarah, Miss Echohawk, like, and then she was so kind to give me one, not to be completely weirded out by this person running up on her, breathing heavy, holding this cracked phone. But on top of that, she's like, "Oh yeah, my assistant will follow up with you." And I was just thinking, like, one, wow, like I talked to her and she was so nice, but I thought it was a polite sort of, because oftentimes when people send you to their assistant, but it's more that also understanding more of what Sarah does, like. She's in charge of so many things and there's so many bands going on. Of course, her assistant, sends me this email and they're like, yeah, we would love to do this. Can we have some more information about it? And then at one point they're like, we'll give you space at our conference if you want to host this hackathon. And that really opened up so many doors in terms of, because once you have a benchmark there, because prior to this, companies had told me, I just don't see natives interested in this, or this, can we open the doors for more groups in this? And it was like, the point of this hackathon is to create space for native folks. Hackathons need to exist in other communities as well, but this specifically was for natives. So to have companies tell me to my face that they didn't see an audience in this, or they didn't see that, and to have Sarah and ACES just not only immediately, yes. And on top of that, I have to say, for the record, this was something they had talked about. ACES had been wanting to do this for a while. So it's not like this wasn't an idea that I had solely come up with. This is an idea that so many other people had. It was just a matter of luck and space and opportunity all coming together. And so that's how I met Sarah. And again, so grateful, because that created this benchmark that now other communities are like, oh, well, they're doing it, we can do this, and they look to that, and it's great.
Well, Sarah, from your perspective, do you have anything to add to this story?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I was thrilled when I met Robin, and she had been part of the panel for this presentation we were doing at NASA for government partners. And when she came up and we had this conversation, I was equally excited, because we knew at ACES that we really needed to be doing more in CS and computer science. And we really didn't know how to do that or where to start. And so when Robin was like, hey, look at this, and I want to do a hackathon, I was like, yes, that's what we need. Absolutely. So we, as she said, we moved forward, and she did the first hackathon at ACES, which has then now grown. It's now a regular part of the conference. And not only that, it's split into 2 different hackathons now. There's one kind of a pre-conference one, which is for middle school and high school students. And just like Robin said, a variety of different ways that they can learn and connect. It's not like this one single project where they have to come in and, spend 24 hours. It's really just exposing Native youth to the possibilities, because as Robin said, like, they don't even realize that they're doing tech, right? So that's happened. And then we also now have a college hackathon, which is a little higher level, and they do some competition. And we have big sponsorship that comes in to support that. And it all started with Robin. And so she was instrumental in creating that and bringing.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And that all happened by her speaking up, kind of stepping out and saying, hey, are you interested in doing this? And, as she said, like, there's no way they're going to want to do this or anything. And we were so happy. So yeah, it was a win-win all the way across. So she was really, really instrumental in doing that.
That's great. Do you have anything to share about anything that's come out of the hackathons or anything?
Well, again, we've just had a lot of more interest in students wanting then to go into CS or into tech. And the attendance at the hackathons is growing. And that's really, that's good news, because, and I don't know if, spit out the statistic now, but today there's still less than 20% of women overall, that are in computer science and engineering, either majoring and or in the workforce. So we know that there's definitely a need to be increasing those numbers. And so seeing this,
and that's women overall.
That's women overall. Yeah. There's not a lot of data, as Robin will, can attest to. There's not a lot of data around Native women in particular in these fields. There's a little bit, the National Science Foundation has some, but we're actually engaging in some of that work right now, along with the American Indian College Fund, the American Indian Graduate Center, and COBEL, doing some data projects, because we do want to drill down into that data, and we all have it. So we are definitely working on
let
that.
me know. I would love to help too on that. So.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we have two big data projects that are being funded by the Lumina Foundation and the Spencer Foundation around. It's overall, but of course, our piece is all around the STEM fields, and computer science and engineering are the two fields that are the most in demand right now. And so it's certainly the most opportunity.
Yeah, well, tell us, I know there's like a lack of data, and it's so great that you're working on data collection, but tell us about, what you've learned in all the years you've been working on this, how to engage Indigenous girls and women in STEM, and then is there a cultural component to that too?
Sure. And again, happy to offer, and then I'd love to hear what Robin has to say, since she's a living example of it, right?
Yeah.
But certainly what we've learned at ACES, first I'll speak generally, and then I'll talk about women and girls. So generally what we've discovered at ACES is that, I think, and Robin talked about this too, like students making that connection to understand, one, how is tech relevant to them, or how is STEM overall relevant to them. And in order to do that, for us, what we've learned is that trying to culturally contextualize that information, or even just lesson plans, is tremendously helpful, because that makes that connection. So an example would be, for just general STEM fields, up in South Dakota, was that Cheyenne River? I was trying to remember which reservation we were at. We did a chemistry lesson around buffalo hide tanning, right? And what is the chemistry behind that? So obviously our ancestors had done that since time immemorial and knew that process, but putting the science behind that and kind of deconstructing it in Western science, if you would, to show how our people understood how to do that, and how we were scientists and knew that even before, right, European contact, makes that connection to students, and they understand that they really are scientists and they really come from that background, right? This is something we've done since time immemorial, same with astronomy and traditional ecological knowledge and plant medicine. So making those connections. We've also done things around language, and then with programming, like spiral robotics. One of the fun things that we did with kids once was to do it around their traditional songs and make their little spiral robotic balls dance, but they had to code that. So there are different ways to do that and kind of light that fire, that spark that gets them engaged. And then they're going, oh, okay, so I could do this, and I see myself connected, and I want to do this. Now with girls, a few things that we've learned from partners, like at the Population Council, and it's actually based in New York. They've done a lot of work with Indigenous women in Africa. And so some things that we've learned from the work that they've done and put out there, and there's some pilots happening, is that they've done a tremendous amount of research. I definitely recommend looking at their research if you're interested in engaging Indigenous girls. But some of what came out of that was understanding that we really need to get girls early in terms of engagement, preferably before middle school, because after that it gets very hard. The other thing is that girls do much better when they're actually separated out from boys and have a learning experience that's separate, because then they don't feel intimidated or like they can't speak up. And I saw an example of this at an ACES event. We have something called STEM Day, which is the day ahead of the conference, where we bring in middle school and high school students, and the sponsors have different activities to get them excited about STEM, and they're very hands-on. So GM had an engine build, and watching this go through, they had like a group of boys and girls come through, and the boys mostly were doing everything and very engaged, and the girls kind of stood back. And then that group moved on, and the next group was a group of girls only, and they were like right in there. And I mean, they were doing it, and they were engaged, and they're asking questions and really trying things out. And it's just because of that age group, right? In middle school, high school, that's the time when you see, adolescence, and that stuff starts to happen, and that separation happens. So we learned some valuable lessons about, needing to create programs specifically for women and girls, right? That it's okay to have these all-inclusive programs, but you really do need to carve out specific programming and support for them. And that's what I think makes a huge difference.
That's great, sharing your experience, that obviously trying to get girls younger and then having a girls only environment for them to thrive. But it sounds like, Robin, you started a little bit later, and I don't think you were in a girls only environment. So share your journey, because even if, for any girls listening, if you're a little bit older than that, obviously you can do it at any time. So why don't you share a little bit about how you, a little more detail. I know you talked about a little bit about how you got into it, and I'm sure there were barriers and you felt maybe not fitting in at certain times.
Yeah, like initially, I never thought of myself as a person in tech, or what I was doing was technical. It was more just a means to an end. It's like, oh, I want this blog sparkly, gonna have to learn some HTML. And then it's like, oh, wait, if I learn JavaScript, I can make things move. And so you start learning like that. But again, because I think it's larger conversation about representation, because I hadn't seen people like myself or heard that the things that I was interested in, like sparkles or making things pretty, are part of tech, or that being creative is part of tech. It's such a huge, now I'm just like, how did I not know this? But the thing is, I think, and this goes back to one of the biggest, to sort of jump on the question that you asked, Sarah, of how one of the things that you've learned about getting people involved in tech. And I really appreciate when you asked me to define hackathon, because communication, the basics of communication, is one of the most important ways to get people involved. And I feel like when it was communicated to me that what I'm doing is part of tech. And I had this great mentor. I was interning, and I wasn't interning on a tech-based thing. I was actually data pulling in DC, and to get out of, which is a lot of menial, it's very tedious. You're just pulling data from websites. And I had been really stubborn right before this. And I said, I only want to pull data from tribal colleges. And they're like, well, wouldn't you want to pull from more universities because there's existing logs there? And I was like, no, I only want to pull from tribal colleges. And my research wants to focus on tribal colleges. And they're like, okay. And then I found out that a lot of tribal colleges don't have those existing databases with existing data sets. So I would have to call each one, or else I would have to comb through the interface on their website. And I was like, I didn't want to admit that I was in over my head. So I just built essentially like out of Python, like a simple aggregator to pull the data for me. Then my boss saw it, and I thought I was in trouble, because she's like, what are you doing? And I didn't want to explain like how out of my element I was. And I was just like, well, I thought it would help with my research. And she's like, no, what are you doing? Why aren't you in tech? And it was that simple question that really opened the door, because I was like, well, I didn't know what I was doing, because anyone could. The only reason that I knew how to code that was I Googled it. Like, and that's with a lot of things. Like when I was learning how to make the blog sparkly, going back to that, it was a matter of like Googling it. So that was really where it was like, I don't know why I'm not in tech. I just don't think what I'm doing is technical. And then it was like, oh, okay, like I can work in tech, but also there's so many more people back home that are a lot smarter than me, that are a lot more adept at doing this. And how come they're not in tech either? Because they're wondering where they fit in. And that's sort of where the hackathons and all of that took place. But it was also decoding a lot of this information, because when I hear tech, I would think of a very specific environment, and I would think of a very specific area, but I wouldn't think where I belonged in that. So it's making these words more accessible. It's making the communication more accessible. And then it's also when you say hackathon, which was a lesson I had to learn, that is a very coded word, because I'm assuming that people know exactly what I mean by that. And then that's on me to define it, and me to make these words more accessible for people. And I think you have two schools of thought in that. There are those that are like, well, if we keep it as this, people in the know will know. But that's the problem. If you want to keep status quo, you keep things with these coded words. So it's about breaking things down, and also making people, it becomes less about getting people involved, and it becomes more about how can you support people in a capacity that we're in. So it's like with a hackathon, it's not about how do I get people to show up to my hackathon so much as it's how can I support people in this area using tech? And that's a really mouthy way to say it. So then sometimes you can break it down further. But I've had multiple lessons in communication and I still constantly realize like, oh, I'm using jargon and that's really bad. And and yeah, but that was sort of my journey into tech. And that's also where I've become even more focused on communication and sort of making this more transparent.
Oh, that's great. And I just want to say to everyone in the audience, we will take some questions at the end. We're going to save a few minutes at the end. So if you have questions, tee them up. We will do that at the end. But I want to follow up, Robin, on what you're talking about, because I love some of the things you've said today about there's no one way to be native. And it was that one question, like, why aren't you in tech? But you are using tech to tell your unique story, to encourage storytelling. And so I think what I love about that is, some people might hear coding and computer science and tech and think, oh my gosh, I have to be an astrophysicist or I have to be a chemical engineer. But you can use tech as a tool for artistic and creative endeavors. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sometimes. So when 5G was coming out and phones were getting 5G capabilities, one of these large companies was like, we want to do something around 5G. And one of the cool things in the space that I am in, I have a much larger platform now and I have access to these large companies, but how do I bring this back to my community in a sense? And how do I tie this back? And so it was like, is there any way we can make this more inclusive? Because not everyone is going to have 5G access. And that's something that I constantly have to remind these larger companies. It's like, not everyone even has electricity at this point. And we're talking about the US, like we have to break it down further. Not everyone has access to Wi-Fi. Not everyone has unlimited data. These are all things we have to acknowledge. So when you're talking about 5G, you've automatically eliminated a huge percent of the not even native, just a huge percent of the population, because it's people who have access to this. So how do you make this more inclusive? And then also the cool thing about these big companies though, is they have these huge budgets. So they just want to see something cool happen. And in my case, it's like, this is where this intersection of like, oh, I can dream of something and you can write it out, and then you can also tie it back to your community and think of a larger scale of how this is going to work. I don't know how many, like, what's exactly under NDA. So there's I am trying to get around that, but I am very proud of some of our work. And Monday, we'll see some of this work launch. But how you tie like tech into creative fields, I think there's unlimited ways to do it. I think of viewing tech as a tool. I think oftentimes it's viewed, and the way that it's presented, certainly the way that it was presented to me initially, and that's why I never thought of myself in tech, was that you're solely going to go into this and you're going to use zeros and ones to build things for other people. It was never, if it had been presented to me as a way to like, hey, this is a tool to help get your story out, or this is a tool to build that app that you're so excited about, or you're really interested in data, well, this tool can help cull data for you in a more efficient way. And I think sort of rephrasing that and viewing it like that, and that has really helped me, because right now I would say the work that I do is I kind of code solely for back on it, like, hey, this is possible, but we have to have a team of coders who come in there and clean up what I've messed up, or they'll come in there and actually make it work. Because sometimes it's like, I know we can kind of do this, I can kind of show you guys when I'm pitching this, but we need to have a whole team come in here. And I think that's where I used to beat myself up when I started getting into coding, of like, because I would say 90% of, at least for me, my coding was not working. And then it's that 10% that it does. And it's such an exciting feeling. And it's great because it's really empowering. And that there are very few things that I felt as empowered as when you get a line of code or something that was difficult for you and then you accomplish it. And I think, again, I can't think of a career where tech wouldn't be beneficial to a person. And that's why more and more it's about taking that stigma. And I think ACES does a great job about that, showing the different ways that this can exist. And especially with Indigenous communities, where for a while there, I was like, well, how does tech and tradition come into play? Because those seem separate. And then you realize, wait, tech is the thing that I think a lot of us have been looking for. It's the tool for those of us that are storytellers, or those of us that are archivists, and those of us that want to preserve stories or help stories live. Tech is a great tool for that. There are different areas of it for different things. People that bead, I mean, there are so many programs out there that can help you figure out like what the best pattern is, or keeping it like holding these spaces for you. I don't know. I don't know if there's a log line or a simple line that I could say about how creative and tech go together, so much as I think tech goes with pretty much everything. And it's just a great tool that more people need to know that they have access to and can accomplish it. Like, I am by no means a great student when I was a student. So it was more, I just had a lot of free time.
That's great. Well, Sarah, I'm so energized by what Robin's saying. Are we seeing more Indigenous people, and particularly more Indigenous girls going in STEM? What are the trends you're seeing right now?
Well, definitely, we're definitely seeing more Indigenous women getting into the STEM fields. At ACES alone, just since I've been there for the 8 years, we've really flipped. It's interesting. When I came in, it was about 54% male, and then 47%, female. And now it's the exact opposite. And that's really happened primarily over the last 3 to 4 years, where now women are the majority of the membership and conference attendees at ACES, right? So it's really taking off. And I think, people like Robin and others who show that this is absolutely, a place where women belong and can be, if we offer them the support and the resources, then that's going to continue to happen. In terms of the overall numbers, we are still struggling as a population in terms of increasing the numbers. I think the last stat I saw for the workforce for engineering, even though, we're about 1.5% of the population, I think we make up about 0.3% of the engineering workforce. So we're not at parity by any stretch, and that still needs to be accomplished. But what I am excited to see is that because of racial equity becoming more visible in terms of what's happened over the last year and a half, 2 years, that we're seeing more corporations, government agencies, universities realizing that they need to be putting a better focus on diversity, equity, inclusion. And then I think Robin made this point, it's not just numbers, right? Like how many people show up or how many people do you recruit into your company. It's like, how are you making changes structurally to the way that you're doing things within these corporations, agencies, and universities that are supportive of other groups, right? So how do we make environments when somebody either goes to school that's Indigenous, how do we make that environment welcoming to them? Because as we know, often, especially with mainstream institutions, you'll often be the only Native student, in a class. Especially if we're talking about these, STEM classes. And as we get into the schools that we certainly have students that are at MIT and at Cornell and Harvard in these schools, and they will often be, might be the only one in their class. So how do we make those environments welcoming? And then the same with corporations and government agencies. How do they change their infrastructure to be better supportive of Indigenous peoples once they hire them? You can't just hire them and then that's it, right? So what are the things that these companies and agencies can do to make that environment more welcoming so that they're going to retain Indigenous talent? So those are some of the things that we are seeing, and that's positive, because if we have support from those, outside communities and sectors, if you will, then that will help us continue to grow, because there has to be opportunity and a supportive place for these people to go, right? You can't just educate and push education and then they have nowhere to actually go and be employed, or someplace where they feel welcome. So those are the things that we're seeing.
What are some of the ways that those environments can be welcoming?
Well, like in corporations and government agencies, what is absolutely essential is that there are, and they're called a number of different things, but like employee resource groups. so that there is a group for Native or Indigenous peoples within those organizations, and not just that it's like this little self-sustaining club, and this is the same that's true for universities, but that there are real resources put behind that group, those groups, so that they have the ability to host events, to perhaps provide scholarships, be mentors, like really supporting them in that, in their ability to do that. And that means having leadership, because that's the other part that needs to change in all of these institutions. Is yes, that's great that they're hiring, Indigenous people into these entry-level positions and increasing their overall numbers, but these people aren't in leadership positions. So for real change to occur, we know that they absolutely have to be in those leadership positions. So where I have seen it the most successful is where there are corporations and government agencies and universities who actually make diversity part of their overall organizational structure and plan, and actually have even performance evaluations that are tied to diversity and making sure that there's equal representation in leadership. So,
well,
that's a lot.
Yeah, I know. Let me ask, what do you see as some of the challenges and opportunities for getting Indigenous women and girls into STEM?
Well, I think, again, we're still dealing with a lot of sexism, although that is changing. And I think as we get a critical mass, that will continue to change. But that's certainly there. And then just in general, for Indigenous peoples, like we're still in our high schools, Native Indigenous students are only getting about half of the math and science courses that they need to be prepared for a STEM major. So I definitely think, whether you're talking about women and girls or Indigenous peoples overall, is doing the preparation in middle school and high school, because what does happen is that when our students get into college, if they get there, and as Robin was saying, like there's a lot of challenges even to doing that, but if they get there and then they're interested in undertaking a STEM, a STEM degree, a STEM field, or excuse me, a STEM major, they don't have the prerequisites, right? And so then they look and they realize they've got to take like another year of classes. That's not, they've got to, and that's time and money, and generally they don't have that. So I think one of the biggest things that we need to be doing to continue to grow this is to be sure that we are also looking back and working even in K through 5, right? We really have to get started early and prepare students and teachers and families to be prepared to go into a STEM field and why it matters. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
How about you, Robin?
I don't want to hog up all the time.
How about you, Robin, from your perspective, what are some of the challenges and opportunities for Indigenous girls to get into STEM?
I think it goes back to seeing themselves in it, echoing what Sarah said. Because oftentimes, and again, this is also a larger talk about inclusion. I really love that one quote. I think it's by Verna Myers, and it's the one about diversity is being invited to the party, but inclusion is being asked to dance. And oftentimes, suddenly companies are interested in Natives or people from marginalized communities. And they're like, well, we want to have this event out there, but they're not thinking, how does this serve us when we don't even have electricity access? Or we don't have Wi-Fi access. And it's more about, it's not just having these programs available, but thinking of the audience that these serve and then helping people see how they belong. And I think that's also sort of an ethical question for companies. If you are going to stop the process at, well, we funded it and this is available, if they want to come, they can come, or are you actually going to take that extra step to show them how they belong? And I feel, especially with young girls, because I am by no means a young girl who is lacking confidence in belonging in tech or feeling that. I feel like because I would have to psych myself up, like, oh, pre all of this, when I was just doing the hackathon circuit to get to travel, basically, because they'd give you a travel stipend, and I would show up to these places, and not only was I one of the few people of color in the room, I was oftentimes the only woman, let alone I had not run into other Natives at that point at these hackathons. And it was a really interesting feeling, because you would have people that I don't even think they were really trying to make me feel intimidated so much as they just assume that I didn't belong there. Like they would ask me, like when you walk into a place and they're like, oh no, this is the hackathon. And it's like, oh, well, yeah, I'm a participant. That automatically is going to stay in my brain the entire time. Yeah. Or sometimes I've gone to, even now, like I'll visit companies or come over to either work on a project or consult on something. And there's an immediate, you know, afterwards people will apologize or someone will, but I think they need to work on, they need to be prepared. Yes. They need to do the work. It's always falling on like, yes, I think natives and indigenous people of like, well, you guys need to belong and put yourself out there and do more of this. And it's, I wouldn't want, because this comes back to sometimes of how like the origin story of how I got involved in tech. And it's like, well, you did this and you were able to do that. And you put yourself out there and you did this. And yes, I do believe putting yourself out there is great and you should always go for it. But we need to think about the people who may not have that confidence there. How do we meet them and how do we show them that they engage? So I think it's just, for me, oftentimes when I'm talking to like with Girls Who Code or just a young group of women, it's more, it becomes less about telling them like hardcore tech stuff and more just like, you guys are great. You're really smart. You need to know that you're smart and you belong there. And it becomes almost like a self-esteem and just reminding them. And it's so helpful to me because I oftentimes realize like, oh, because you build up this idea because it's like, I'm going to go into this building and show them I belong. But then when you're around other people where it's like, okay, I can breathe and I can be myself and I can tell you guys how nervous I am when I'm in those buildings and I wouldn't want you guys to go through this. So like, just know that you belong there. And I think it's that very human thing of building up other people and letting Indigenous women know that not only do they belong in the room, they can provide something that no one else can, because no one else is going to have their perspective or no one else is going to have their life experience and so much a part of tech is combining your outside knowledge with this basic thing that anyone can learn, and that's code.
Yeah, well, that's great. And I love that, to say to girls, you do belong, because they do. So we've gotten a few questions, and so I'll turn to some of those. The first one is, with regard to Native communities not having the same baseline of resources or like data sets at Native colleges, connectivity at homes, is narrowing that gap part of the goals of these hackathons? Do you want to answer, Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely is. And I think, Robin alluded to this, and we spoke a little bit about this ahead of time too, that yes, that's part of it. And I think raising awareness about, as Robin was talking about some of the issues that, not all, and I think that's another thing, right? Indian country is we're very diverse, but certainly there are a lot of communities that don't have the kind of internet access or broadband access, right, that others have. We are the most disconnected population, if you will, in the United States. So I think to recognize that before, if you're working in a community, but certainly, yes, part of this is to close the gap and to try to get more folks involved or engaged. So I don't know, Robin, if you have anything you want to say about that.
Yeah, anything you want to add, Robin?
No, I think that's it, because
it opens the door.
Yeah, this is a continuing issue. Like, I don't have the solid answer for that. And it's one of those that I figure out like, oh, okay, like maybe building this or working on this or letting people know that this is available. I don't think there is an easy cure all for it, because there's so many different factors that go into play, because you can have some reservations that are operating with fiber and and then you have other reservations where, again, we're just trying to get electricity access. So there isn't one be all, but I think hackathons at the baseline just provide eyes on a problem. Like, I know some of these bigger companies, when they've supported small workshops or things like that, they're surprised by what's needed, because oftentimes it's like, well, we can give you guys money for this. And it's like, I don't want money. Like, we need engineers to come down here and mentor. And it's like, oh, well, can't you pull in engineers locally? And it's then that becomes well, maybe I should explain a little more to you about the community. So I don't know I haven't seen data on it, and I don't know that for me, I would say when I was putting on workshops and hackathons, it was solely just, hey, we learned something cool, want to share it, and then it became more of an activism based thing or an advocacy based thing. But that wasn't it wasn't that great of a altruistic beginning so much as this is cool, let's build.
Well, and I would add too, the other part that I think, and I meant to say this before, that's important, and I think again, Robin talks, alluded to this, is that what we realize is that often the students this is what we realized at ACES, that the students that we were helping and supporting for the most part were a lot of the students who had access, right? Who had good grades, had supportive parents, had, supportive families, had access to education and all of those things. And so they really were the, kind of the rising stars, the top talent, and we absolutely want to support them. But then recognizing that we're missing a whole lot of potential, right? Women and girls, especially, that could be engaged in STEM, but we need to figure out how to get to them and how to support them, and then convince our partners that they are also worthy of that investment. And yeah, I had a student who's now a NASA, JPL engineer who works on the Mars rover, male student, Aaron Yazzie, and now he's done all these amazing things. But when he was a student at Stanford, his grades fell and he lost many of his scholarships except ACES, because we recognize that, it's more important to support him and what he's trying to do rather than worry about his GPA and that hard. So I think just another lesson there is like, getting out of these kind of rigid ideas about what it is to be a STEM person and what you're looking for, because really what you're looking for is somebody with interest and perseverance, who's ready, and wants to be engaged. So we need to kind of step out of those rigid definitions if we really want to do this.
Yeah, we've got another question. As a non-Native woman, what organization and groups would be good to target for providing support to getting Native American girls into STEM? Well, I have two answers for you. One is ACES and the Caroline and Ora Smith Foundation, but I didn't know, Sarah, Robin, if you have other thoughts.
Yeah, I'm certainly, I'd love to, I can, and maybe Robin as well, can follow up with, list of resources. But there are others, like there's a Native Women in Tech that was started by Andrea Delgado Olson, who's on our board. There's a few other organizations that are smaller, not as large scale as, say, what, the work that Mary and I are doing. So there's a lot of organizations out there, but of course I would definitely press for ACES and for the work that Mary's doing, because that is part of our work. And that's what we do. We work with partners who aren't necessarily led by Indigenous peoples to bring them in and help them build their Indigenous talent.
Did you want to add anything, Robin?
Well, along with, again, ACES, and we can send a list later, but there's also Natives in Tech. There's also, I believe, the American Indian College Fund. Their name doesn't really showcase all the wealth of things that they work on, and they provide a lot of source. Sometimes it's just resources or showing like other avenues that people can pursue. And then I also do think that Girls Who Code and a lot of organizations that aren't necessarily just Native based do a really great job of getting young women feeling confident within a tech space. And that's, I think, just a larger thing about not one organization might not be able to provide all the resources that, the end all when it comes to answering the problem of women in STEM, or how do we get more women involved in STEM. And I wanted to, sorry, now I'm just blanking on it, but it was like, I wanted to jump on, Sarah had mentioned when she was talking about getting women involved in STEM, and ACES provided meeting people where they're at. I'm sorry, that's where it was, meeting people where they're at. And that was one of the great things about ACES and the American Indian College Fund and colleges in general for me, because I would go through wild fluctuations as a student. And I realized if I was at an outside institution, I would have been dropped immediately. And the thing is, if you are dropped from your courses, you have to leave your dorm, everything compounds on itself. And oftentimes these institutions, if was very humanizing. It felt like they were looking at me as a student. They understood the stresses that I was going through. They also understood the different things that you were facing. Like there's a different level of poverty in certain areas. There's a different level of poverty for people in rural areas. So my access to things was limited, and to have organizations like that humanize the experience of going to college and pursuing careers in tech meant everything to me. And I can't express how grateful I was for that. So I just thought that was such an important point, and I had wanted to bring that back of that's true. And also acknowledging that we have different like metrics of success in certain communities, and meeting that instead of pushing people to go to Google and Palo Alto and having to leave the reservation. There's oftentimes we want to bring it back home and acknowledging that. But
yeah, well, this panel has been so fantastic. We only have about 4 minutes left. So I wanted to ask our Sarah and Robin one last question. And what would you want young Native girls and women to leave this panel with? Like, what advice would you give them if they want to go into STEM? So I'll start with you, Robin. You each have about one minute.
Okay, I'm gonna watch the clock because I ramble. But it's just that they belong, and that again, tech is a tool, and you can use this to take you where you want to go. And sometimes it'll take you to places that you didn't expect. Never thought, I didn't know being a creative was a career. I thought it was just something everyone was and an adjective. But it's again, that Native people belong in the spaces that they want to belong in. You belong in the spaces that you want to take space in. It's yours to take space. It's yours to belong, and we can build crazy things with tech. And I think that's where I'll leave it.
How about you, Sarah?
Yeah, and to build on that, exactly. I agree. And part of that is, trying to reach out and get involved in as many places as you can that are supportive. And I saw a question, they're just running by, but somebody asked about SACNAS, which is the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Indians in Science. I can't remember the exact acronym, but that's another organization. And yes, so, join those organizations, all of those. Join ACES, join Society of Women Engineers, join Natives in Tech, join ACES, take advantage of all of those opportunities, because there is a lot of support out there. And I think, like Robin said, when she started looking on the internet and realizing there's a lot of, places to make those connections. And so that's what I would say is, yes, you belong. So reach out, right? And I know that that's hard, and we will try to do our part in reaching out and connecting with you as well. But I think, you've got to step forward and take advantage of those opportunities. And there are a lot of them. And just, as I tell all students, just perseverance. You just have to keep going. It's tough, but you just got to keep going. It's not easy.
I would like to add, just also for those of us who have left the student space or are more in a more professional space, I'm constantly surprised at the tiny little things that I know that might help out somebody. Yeah. Like I've had students reach out to me and they're just like, what was this conference like? How did this help? And then I remember back to when I was a student and people explaining tiny little things like what FAFSA was, which everyone assumes people know, right. But people walking me through that or explaining that, anytime you can make something more transparent, it's so helpful to younger people or people just new to it. I shouldn't use the term younger, but people new to a space is making things transparent was super helpful. And yeah.
Oh, I should add that ACES has free membership for middle school, high school, and college students. So that's
great.
Free to join.
Great. Yeah. Last thought. We have 1 minute left, and this panel has been incredible. I think some of the things I've taken away from it is there's no one way to be Native, and that you belong. If you take one thing away from this, and we hope that more Indigenous women and girls go into STEM. And in advance, I'm going to wish everyone for Monday, happy Indigenous Peoples Day. And the Museum of Native American History, along with my foundation, the Carolina Nora Smith Foundation, and the Mitchell Museum of the American Indian, we're hosting 2 special Indigenous Peoples programs on Monday on Indian boarding schools, one at noon Central, one at 6 p.m. Central, and go to www.mitchellmuseum.org to register, or you can find information on the MONAH site as well. So thank you to everyone. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you.